They wanted a war. The media, the talking heads, the algorithm that feeds on female athletes tearing each other apart. For 3 straight years, they worked overtime to create the most toxic narrative in women's basketball history. Paige Bueckers versus Caitlin Clark. The UConn prodigy against the Iowa sensation. 2 queens who supposedly couldn't share the same throne. And just when that manufactured rivalry reached a fever pitch. When the clicks were flowing and the hate was spreading like wildfire, something happened inside a closed-door USA basketball training camp that nobody saw coming. Footage leaked. An interview dropped. And what the world witnessed didn't just challenge the rivalry narrative, it obliterated it. But here's the thing nobody is talking about. What Paige Bueckers said in that interview and what happened on that practice court reveals something far more significant than a simple friendship between 2 players. It exposes a terrifying new reality for every other team on the planet. And it might just signal the beginning of the most dominant era women's basketball has ever seen. So, let's rewind for a second. Let's talk about what the media machine built over the last 3 years. Because understanding a lie is the only way to appreciate how powerful the truth actually is. From the moment Paige Bueckers arrived at UConn in 2020, she was a face of women's college basketball. And I'm not exaggerating. This wasn't just hype. The woman became the first freshman in history to win National Player of the Year. First ever. She had magazine covers, endorsement deals, a basketball IQ that made seasoned analysts look foolish trying to break down her game. Paige was supposed to be the chosen one who would carry women's basketball into its next golden era. Then injuries happened. A knee injury sidelined her sophomore season. Another setback during her junior year. And while Paige was grinding through rehabilitation, watching from the sidelines in a knee brace, Caitlin Clark exploded onto the scene like a supernova. Scoring record shattered. The Logo 3 became appointment television. Suddenly, the spotlight that once belonged exclusively to Paige was pointed in an entirely different direction. Iowa Caitlin Clark, the new face of women's basketball. And the media, they smell blood. See, here's what the sports media industrial complex understands better than anything. Conflict sells. Harmony doesn't generate clicks. Nobody shares a headline that says, 2 talented players respect each other. But Paige Bueckers seething at Caitlin Clark's success. That's engagement. That's comments. That's money. So, they manufactured tension where none existed. Every time Caitlin broke a record, outlets ran stories analyzing Paige's reaction or lack thereof. Every stack comparison became evidence of jealousy. Every Final Four matchup was framed as personal vendetta. The Caitlin versus Paige wars weren't organic. They were constructed brick by brick, click by click, and the most insidious part, fans bought in. Social media became a war zone. Team Paige versus Team Caitlin. Vicious arguments in comment sections. Grown adults attacking each other over 2 college athletes who had never publicly said a negative word about one another. The toxicity became self-sustaining. The media created the fire and fans kept throwing gasoline on it. This was the landscape heading into the USA basketball training camp. Think about what that environment meant. You had Caitlin Clark, a rookie who has spent months getting physically targeted in the WNBA, face guard like a criminal and verbally dismissed by veterans who should know better, walk into a gym filled with the same people who had thrown shade at her. And you had Paige Bueckers, the woman who supposedly resented Caitlin for stealing her spotlight, preparing to share a practice court with her so-called rival for the first time in months. The cameras were there. The media was salivating. Everyone expected awkwardness, cold shoulders, isolated drills, maybe a subtle exchange of dirty looks that would fuel headlines for weeks. What they got instead was something that completely shattered the narrative they'd spent 3 years building. And when that footage leaked online, you could almost hear the collective gasp from every outlet that had profited from the fake rivalry. Because what the world saw wasn't tension. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't 2 queens fighting for one throne. It was basketball nirvana. Paige and Caitlin weren't just coexisting. They were thriving together. And the chemistry between them was so natural, so immediate, so effortless that almost felt scripted. Except it wasn't. This was real. And what happened next when Paige sat down for that interview and opened her mouth, which sent shock waves through the entire basketball world, because she didn't just praise Caitlin Clark. She did something far more powerful. She exposed everyone who would ever try to pit them against each other, and she revealed exactly why the rest of the world should be terrified of what's coming. The clips were grainy, shot from the sidelines, probably a phone held by someone who wasn't supposed to be recording. But what those clips captured was crystal clear. Paige Bueckers and Caitlin Clark weren't just sharing a court. They were reading each other's minds. Let me paint this picture for you because the footage alone doesn't do justice to what was actually happening on that practice floor. USA basketball training camp brings together the absolute elite. We're talking WNBA legends, Olympic gold medalists, future Hall of Famers, and in the middle of all that experience, you had two players who the media swore were enemies running the backcourt together like they've been teammates since middle school. The first clip that went viral showed a simple scrimmage drill. Nothing fancy, just 5-on-5 action. Caitlin brings the ball up the floor and immediately the defense panics. You can see it in their body language. They step up past the three-point line because everyone knows what Caitlin Clark does from 30 feet. That logo range gravity is real. Defenders can't sag off. They can't play conservative. They have to respect the threat. And the second they commit to Caitlin, the entire lane opens up. Paige saw it before anyone else. While the defense was scrambling to contain Caitlin's shooting threat, Paige made a backdoor cut so smooth, so perfectly timed that it looked choreographed. Caitlin hit her with a no-look pass that threaded 3 defenders. Easy bucket, high five, smiles all around, one play. That's all it took. And suddenly, everyone watching understood something that should have been obvious all along. These two aren't rivals. They're the most dangerous backcourt combination women's basketball has ever seen. But here's what really stood out in those practice clips. It wasn't just the one play. It was every single possession. Watch Caitlin operate on perimeter and Paige becomes a ghost. She disappears into the gaps. She finds the soft spots in the defense that shouldn't exist. She moves without the ball with surgical precision, exploiting every ounce of space that Caitlin's gravitational pull creates. And Caitlin, she finds her every single time. That passing ability, the one that gets overlooked because everyone focuses on the scoring, was on full display. Skip passes across the court that arrived exactly where Paige's hands would be. Pocket passes through traffic that defied logic. Entry feeds that turned simple post-ups into automatic buckets. It was symbiotic. Now, I need to be careful here because I'm not claiming to know what's in anyone's heart. I'm not saying there's some conspiracy or that the commissioner woke up one morning and decided to tank her own league. What I am saying is that patterns matter. And the pattern we're seeing in real time is one of an institution that appears uncomfortable with its own success. Think about how insane that sentence is. An institution uncomfortable with its own success. That's not a phrase you hear in professional sports. Success is the goal. Success is what you build toward. Success is supposed to make everyone rich, famous, and vindicated. But here's the thing about success. When it arrives faster and louder than you planned, it exposes things. It reveals cracks in the foundation that nobody wanted to acknowledge. And in this case, what it's exposing is a fundamental tension between how the WNBA has always seen itself and how the world now sees it. Because of Caitlin Clark, the league spent years, decades, building a certain narrative, a narrative of unity, of sisterhood, of the collective rising together with no single player towering above the rest. That philosophy made sense when you were fighting for scraps of attention, when nobody knew your name and you were trying to convince the world that women's basketball deserved a seat at the table. But that philosophy was never designed for this. It was never built to handle a moment when one player becomes so big that she accidentally makes the entire table about herself. That's not her fault. That's not a character flaw. That's just what happens when talent meets timing meets cultural hunger meets about 15 million people who suddenly realize they've been missing out on something special. The problem is that the league's entire identity was built around avoiding that exact scenario. And now here it is happening anyway. And nobody in charge seemed to know what to do with it. Fighting for scraps of attention when nobody knew your name and you were trying to convince the world that women's basketball deserved a seat at the table. But that philosophy was never designed for this. It was never built to handle a moment when one player becomes so big that she accidentally makes an entire table about herself. That's not her fault. That's not a character flaw. That's just what happens when talent meets timing meets cultural hunger meets about 15 million people who suddenly realize they've been missing out on something special. The problem is that the league's entire identity was built around avoiding that exact scenario. And now here it is happening anyway. And nobody in charge seems to know what to do with it. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. And no, I'm not talking about the sponsors or the brands or the endless stream of commercials. I'm talking about the money. Because somewhere beneath all the talk about culture and sisterhood and collective success, there's a conversation nobody in the WNBA wants to have out loud and has everything to do with the uncomfortable reality of economics. You see, Caitlin Clark is out here landing commercial deals that probably exceed the total value of what most WNBA franchises are worth. She's signing contracts that make her league salary look like a rounding error. And every single time that happens, every time she fronts another national campaign or appears in another high-production advertisement, it shines a spotlight on someone the league has been hoping to avoid discussing. The massive gap between what these players generate and what they receive. Let me break this down in terms that even the folks in the back can understand. When a player can independently generate more revenue through endorsements than her entire league salary cap, something is seriously out of whack. And I don't say that to criticize the players. I say that to highlight a structural problem that's been festering for years, waiting for someone talented enough and popular enough to expose it. Caitlin Clark didn't ask for this role. She didn't set out to become the face of systemic economic imbalance in professional women's sports. She just showed up and started playing basketball the way she's always played it. Brilliantly, unapologetically, with a flair that makes people who have never watched a basketball game in their lives suddenly become experts on her every move. But here's what that success does. It forces questions that the league hasn't ready to answer. Questions like, if this one player can drive sold-out arenas, record-breaking ratings, and cultural relevance that transcend sport entirely, why are the economic structures around her still operating in survival mode? Why does a league that claims to be growing and thriving still depend so heavily on external support to stay financially viable? I want you to understand something. These aren't attack questions. These are legitimate business questions that any serious analyst would ask in this situation. When your most visible asset is generating value that dwarfs your institutional capacity, that should be a moment of celebration and strategic recalibration. It should be a time when leadership says, okay, we need to restructure. We need to reinvest. We need to make sure this ecosystem can sustain and reward the talent that's making all this possible. But that's not what we're seeing. Instead, what we're seeing is something that looks a lot like defensiveness, hesitation, and institutional reluctance to fully embrace the very success that should be making everyone's lives easier. And I have to ask, why? Why would a league push back against the one thing that could solve most of its problems? Why would leadership appear frustrated by momentum they've been chasing for 30 years? The answer, I believe, lies in something deeper than money. It lies in control. Because here's what the economic reality of Caitlin Clark's situation reveals. The league is no longer the center of the universe, the brands, the sponsors, the media outlets. They're coming directly to her. They're not waiting for the league's permission or blessing. They're skipping the middleman entirely and cutting deals that make the WNBA's role in all this look almost optional. That's a terrifying position for any institution to find itself in, because when you control the distribution of attention, you control the power. When the distribution happens without you, the power slips away. And institutions don't give up power willingly, even when giving it up would make everyone more successful in the long run. Let me take this conversation somewhere that might make some people uncomfortable. But this is what we do here. We don't shy away from the hard stuff. We go there because the truth is rarely comfortable. And the truth about what's happening in the WNBA right now is about as uncomfortable as it gets. What I'm about to say is not an accusation. It's an observation based on patterns that anyone with eyes can see and anyone with a brain should be thinking about. Here it is. When a league's most valuable asset doesn't feel protected from the top, that lack of protection has a way of trickling down through the entire ecosystem. Now, I'm not saying anyone told anyone to do anything. I'm not suggesting some kind of coordinated effort to take Caitlin Clark down a peg or two. That's not what this is about. What I'm talking about is something more subtle, more insidious, and frankly more human. I'm talking about signals. In elite professional sports, signals matter.